Welcome back, and we welcome in Pat McGuigan with CapitolBeatOK.com. Pat, good to see you this morning. Of course, the big political news, whether you're talking about the state, whether you're talking about national, it was the deal that got done in Congress earlier this week. There was a lot of political theater there regarding this debt limit deal. How do you see what went on? How would you describe what actually took place?
Cato Institute, which is a pretty libertarian kind of think tank, they characterized it as a deal, not a solution. And whether you agree with the contents of the essay that followed or not, that's a pretty good description. This was a deal. It's an imperfect deal. Wound up passing very strong majorities in both the House and the Senate, but it's a deal. It's not an end to the debate. And there was some sense that kind of surprised me on the part even of pretty knowledgeable people that, well, you know, gosh, why didn't this settle the argument? Of course it didn't settle the argument because there's so many complexities. It's very small initial budget cuts, but it's a guarantee of a couple of $1 trillion over 10 years, and then it increases the debt limit by a similar amount, and then there's triggers in place, this so-called super Congress, that will review things and then have their straight up or down vote on what they decide. The likelihood, in fact the guarantee, of a balanced budget amendment at some point, a vote on it, not that it would pass, and then finally sequestration or automatic across-the-board cuts if none of the above works. So it's got some teeth in it, but it's a deal. It's not a permanent end to the discussion.
Talk about the votes of the Oklahoma delegation, because you had very different positions taken in the House versus the Senate.
Yeah, in the House, it was pretty interesting because all of those four Republican members had hung pretty tough for an aggressive approach on the debt, whereas Congressman Boren had fluctuated some. In the end, all five, one Democrat, four Republicans, all voted for it, expressing varying degrees of angst or anxiety about what they had just done. In the Senate, on the other hand, both Inhofe and Coburn, who, as you know, have often split on some significant votes like this, they were together. Inhofe very concerned about potential defense cuts under the automatic reductions that I've referred to, and then Coburn just thinking it was not enough of a real deal, and that it wasn't aggressive enough in the direction of the kinds of things he has advocated as an off-and-on member of the Gang of Six, and then his own Back in Black proposal. So that was another interesting thing. In fact, if you burrow in on this, the Democrats were 95 to 95, the Republicans were 174 to 66, and the 66 have been more vocal, the 66 that oppose the deal.
Right.
So there is a lot of arguing still going on as we go forward. I will say the bottom line is we're not looking at a national default. And I think that there needs to be some reminding that although this doesn't solve deficit problems in the long term for the country, let alone the year debt itself, in the short term, you got a deal. You got a deal that keeps the markets from imploding. And I would say, too, that I think that George W. Bush is not the topic anymore. I think now that the topic, to some extent, for 2012 is going to be Barack Obama and his leadership.
Speaking of George W. Bush, there has been some talk throughout this debate about how other presidents would have handled this, how President Ronald Reagan might have handled this. You worked for Reagan for a time. I mean, how do you think he would have dealt with this?
Yeah, I didn't work directly for Reagan. I was a strong supporter of his. I interviewed him once wearing my journalistic hat and then worked closely with his administration, especially on judicial nominations. And I will make one comment, that Reagan had an ability, first of all, he actually liked his opponents. And that's kind of an open question. Now, there's a lot of polarization in our country right now, so I wouldn't put all that on Barack Obama by any means. But Reagan actually liked his opponents, and he had an ability to read them and try to find little pieces of common ground. Now, he raised the debt ceiling more than a dozen times during his presidency, but he never had control of the House, which is the House of Representatives, where all spending measures have to originate. So he never really had the power that this president has had in terms of having a chamber that can block whatever the House does. So long story short, Reagan, I believe, would have made a deal like this earlier. Now, having said that, I hasten to add that he actually went to the extent of letting the government shut down once and forcing it to operate on the basis of a continuing resolution. But he had this ability to convey principles with a pragmatic leavening and then an ability to reach his opponents that I don't know if it's a circumstance of the times or the difference in the character between Reagan and Obama. I just think Reagan had more ability to find common ground.
So do you think that this becomes now part of our discourse over the next several years? I mean, is this a debate that's going to continue now for quite some time? Or are we done with this?
Here's what I think we should watch for. Defense, real important in Oklahoma. Jim Inhofe's been raising a lot of concerns about potential automatic budget cuts in the defense area. So watch that. Watch how the markets react. They reacted very poorly initially, but that was because of the accumulation of a lot of bad news and the fact that the debt and default situation only got addressed at the last minute. The balanced budget amendment, and what kind of teeth, if any, real teeth. Is it just going to be an expression of an objective, or is it going to have teeth in it? Is it going to be meaningful? That's something to watch for. Money pushed down to the states or shared with the states in return for the things the state does to get that money from the federal government. I think that's going to become much more of an open question, in part because there's going to be less money for the federal government to share. Oklahoma, farm subsidies. Watch farm subsidies as a very important issue. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all the other entitlements. Can they be sustained when we're actually trying to pay our bills in real time rather than just accumulating endless debt for the future? And finally, there are some alternative plans that are out there that we might see get some strength, like a methodical 1% reduction a year in actual spending combined with a balanced budget amendment. Some analysts say, some economists say, could get us to a balanced budget in an 8 to 10 year period.
Maybe true reform of the tax system.
Well,
maybe that's
that would be interesting, yeah, like we're trying to do in Oklahoma.
Yeah. Pat, thank you. You can read more about this and other topics at CapitolBeatOK.com. Appreciate you being with us, Pat. Thank you. We'll see you next week.